Some stories don't just break the law. They break the very idea of what a human heart is capable of. Our documentary begins on a quiet coastal trail, the kind of place families go for sunrise walks and where nothing truly bad is supposed to happen. But on this particular morning, beneath the soft glow of dawn, a jogger stumbled upon something that would ignite a statewide investigation. The body of 20-year-old Eli Turner, a beloved college student with a future everyone believed was uncheckable. At first glance, the scene looked almost staged, as if someone wanted him to be found, but not the truth behind his death. And that truth was darker than anyone imagined. Because behind Eli's murder wasn't a stranger or a random act of violence. It was someone he trusted, someone who smiled in family photos. Someone who believed they were saving their own child by destroying someone else's. How does a person cross that line? And more importantly, why? Before we unravel this heartbreaking case, take a second to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dive documentaries. It really helps the channel grow and lets us keep telling stories that deserve to be heard. Thanks for being here. Now let's dig in. Dawn along the coastline has a way of making the world feel innocent, as if every mistake from the night before is quietly erased by the rising sun. The sky begins as a soft gradient of pale blues and bruised violets, spreading calm across the cliffs that hug the ocean. Fishermen heading to work, past joggers who chase sunrise as though it's part of their daily therapy. And for the most part, people believe they're safe in these moments, untouched by the darker undercurrents that run beneath ordinary life. That morning was no different. The waves rolled in their slow, rhythmic breaths. The air carried the scent of salt and eucalyptus, and the trail leading along the cliffs felt like a sanctuary suspended above the crashing tide. It was the kind of place where no one expects to find death. Yet on that morning, death had been waiting quietly for someone to discover it. The jogger who found him later said she almost kept running, almost ignored the shape on the ground the way one dismisses a log or a stray backpack left by an early hiker. But something about the stillness of the body felt wrong. Something about the unnatural angle of the arm, the way the torso didn't rise with breath, the way the soft light revealed a color no living skin ever holds. She remembered the moment with a tremor in her voice, how she slowed her pace, how her footsteps crunched over the dry brush, how the warmth from her run stopped abruptly and left only a sickly chill running through her limbs. She would never forget that she first whispered, "Are you okay?" even though every part of her already knew the answer. When she knelt beside him, his eyes were half open, glassy and suspended between the last thing he saw and the nothingness that followed. Beside his hand lay a phone, still unlocked, still illuminated, as though waiting for him to respond. She asked again, shaking now, even though no breath came, and the coldness beneath her fingertips told her she was no longer asking a living person anything. Within minutes, the trail that usually welcomed silence and solitude was swallowed by sirens. Paramedics arrived first, though they quickly stepped back, bowing their heads as if respecting the peacefulness of a place they were now forced to contaminate with tragedy. The police followed soon after, weaving markers across the dirt, photographing every angle of the scene. And as the early sun stretched across the cliffs, it illuminated the victim's face fully. Eli Turner, age 20, a promising college student who should have been in class that morning, not lying alone on the earth, with no chance to see another sunrise. His backpack remained zipped at his side. His wallet sat untouched in his pocket. His shoes, spotless and new, were neatly tied. None of it made sense. If this had been a robbery, the scene would have looked entirely different. If it had been a fight, his knuckles would have shown cuts or his clothing would be torn. But everything around him appeared calculated, organized almost, as if someone had wanted him found, but not the truth behind how he ended up there. Detective Aaron Delaney arrived last, rubbing sleep out of his eyes with the back of his hand as he ducked under the yellow tape. He wasn't the kind of man easily shaken, but something about the placement of the body, the way the weapon lay not far off, and the oddly preserved condition of the victim made him pause longer than usual. Delaney had worked homicide for 16 years, through cases that ranged from the predictable to the unthinkable. And this case, from the very first moment, seemed to whisper that it belonged in the latter category. The air felt too still. The silence felt too orchestrated. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath, as if the cliffs themselves were unwilling to carry whatever story had unfolded the night before. He crouched next to the body, scanning the footprints leading to and from the scene, or rather, the lack of them. Whoever had brought Eli there had either known exactly how to avoid leaving a trail, or the wind had erased the traces. Yet one detail lingered in the dirt, a faint partial shoe print, small in size, possibly belonging to someone lighter, someone who might not have been expected to be involved in something like this. Detective Delaney flagged it mentally, but kept his focus on the immediate question. Why would someone kill a young man like Eli Turner in a place as open and exposed as this? Most criminals avoided public trails. Too many variables, too many opportunities to be seen. Yet Eli had been shot twice in a location where anyone could stumble across him at any time. Unless, Delaney thought, that was the point, to ensure he was found before the body cooled, before suspicion drifted anywhere else. Other officers retrieved Eli's ID, confirming what his parents would soon learn in the most devastating phone call of their lives. Delaney braced himself as he always did before speaking about a victim's family. He had read Eli's name quietly to himself, twice, almost as if trying to commit it to memory before it became a headline. He scribbled notes about the scene, all the while observing the phone still lit with a backlight, still clinging to a message Eli never got to send or finish reading. That phone, Delaney knew, might hold the truth, or at least the last thread leading to it. On the screen was a message preview showing the name Lila, the girlfriend. The text bubble visible read only, "She said she wants to," and that unfinished sentence struck the detective harder than he expected, because unfinished sentences often meant unfinished plans, unfinished lives, and unfinished attempts to save oneself from danger one never saw coming. As officers secured the trail and closed public access, news began trickling through the town. Whispers at coffee shops, murmurs between neighbors, worried glances from students who recognized the name when it hit local alerts. Eli Turner wasn't just any college kid. He was the type of young man whose professors remembered him, whose classmates admired him, whose work ethic drew praise. He was bright, hopeful, and according to early interviews with his friends, very much in love with his girlfriend Lila Moreno. The two were said to be planning something special that week, though no one yet knew exactly what that meant. What they did know was that Eli's decision to meet someone on that trail the night before had not been spontaneous. He had told at least two friends that he was going to straighten things out. What things, his friends couldn't say. But the expression suggested a conflict, the quiet kind that brews beneath the surface until it cannot be ignored any longer. By mid-morning, Delaney had spoken to two rangers who had patrolled the area the night before. Neither recalled seeing anything unusual. No raised voices, no suspicious vehicles, no signs of struggle. But both admitted that the trails were nearly empty at dusk, giving someone ample opportunity to lure a victim into a secluded pocket of the reserve. The detective jotted down a note to pull traffic camera footage from nearby intersections, though his instinct told him something much more personal had happened here. Crimes committed with this level of precision usually weren't random. They were rooted in emotion, in resentment, in the tangled threads of relationships that outsiders rarely see. And the positioning of the body, laid out cleanly, almost respectfully, hinted at familiarity. Someone had looked him in the eye. Someone had chosen the moment, the words, the setting. When Lila was finally brought in for questioning, her face red and swollen from tears, her hands shaking so violently she had to hold them under the table, Delaney didn't treat her as a suspect, not yet. Instead, he gently asked about the last time she'd heard from Eli. She told him about the message he'd sent the night before, the one about meeting someone to talk things out, to fix what was broken. She believed he was meeting her mother, Valerie, though she had no idea what they planned to discuss. What she did know was that Eli had been hopeful, almost excited. He thought things were finally turning around. And that optimism, Delaney noted, was the cruelest part of all. Because hope had brought Eli to that trail. Hope had convinced him he was safe. Hope had made him vulnerable to whoever stood in front of him with a gun. Lila's grief only deepened the detective's resolve. Each word she offered became another piece of a puzzle that he now understood was not just about murder. It was about betrayal. She apologized repeatedly, though she had nothing to apologize for, whispering that she should have gone with him, that she should have convinced him to wait until the morning, that she should have seen the signs. Trauma often leads people to assume responsibility for events they had no way of controlling, no way of predicting. Delaney knew better than to feed into those feelings, but he also knew grief sometimes loosened the truth. And the truth he needed revolved around the question forming quietly beneath Lila's trembling voice. Why had her mother wanted to meet Eli alone? Back at the scene, forensic technicians collected the weapon. A handgun left lying too neatly beside the body, almost as if placed rather than dropped. The absence of fingerprints meant careful wiping, yet the placement felt too intentional, too exposed, almost begging investigators to look more closely at it. That alone told Delaney something important. Guilt wasn't being hidden here. It was being framed, positioned, manipulated into a narrative someone wanted the police to believe. Murderers who planned everything rarely left the weapon. Unless, of course, leaving it served a purpose. As the sun rose higher, casting bright light on the cliffs, tourists began to gather at the blocked entrances, whispering about the news, speculating about motive, crime, identity. Rumors grew quickly. A robbery gone wrong, a gang initiation, a secret affair. But Delaney ignored all of that. He focused instead on the one detail that mattered above all. Eli Turner was the kind of young man who had no enemies. And when victims with no enemies end up dead under mysterious circumstances, the killer is almost always someone who believes they have a reason, even if that reason is rooted in delusion, fear, prejudice, or twisted love. Eli's parents arrived at the station that afternoon. Their grief filled the room in a way words never could. His mother clutched the edges of her sweater as though it held her together, while his father tried and failed to swallow the trembling in his voice when describing the last time they saw their son alive. He spoke of Eli's kindness, his ambition, his decency. He spoke of the son who stayed late helping classmates, who volunteered at shelters, who had dreams of becoming a pediatric physician because he wanted to be the kind of adult he needed during his own childhood hospital visits. The more they spoke, the more the weight of the case shifted inside Delaney's mind. This wasn't just a murder. It was a rupture, a tearing away of a future filled with promise. By evening, the detective sat at his desk reviewing everything they had so far. The timeline was forming, but not complete. The motive was whispering, but not speaking. The connections were visible, but not yet linked. Yet one name hovered over every page of his notes: Valerie Moreno, a woman whom Eli had gone to meet, a woman whose relationship with her daughter was reportedly strained, a woman who, according to Lila, did not approve of Eli, and disapproval, Delaney knew, was often just a polite word people used to mask much uglier truths. The chapter closes not with an answer, but with a chilling understanding forming in Delaney's gut. Eli Turner's murder didn't begin on that trail. It began long before, in living rooms, in quiet resentments, in buried beliefs that shaped the way people see others. And as he stared at the evidence board that night, the detective realized that solving this case meant peeling back layers of family history, unspoken tensions, and the dark corners of the human heart. Because someone had killed Eli Turner out of something deeper than anger, something colder, something far more personal. Before tragedy rewrote his story, Eli Turner lived a life stitched together by small, meaningful moments that painted a picture of who he truly was. To understand the weight of his loss, you have to step back into his world, not the world defined by police reports, forensic diagrams, or courtroom arguments, but the quiet human world he built through kindness, determination, and the simple intention to do right by the people he loved. Eli grew up in a modest 2-bedroom townhouse on the edge of the city, where every wall seemed to echo with warmth rather than wealth. His parents, Mark and Danielle Turner, weren't wealthy and they weren't influential, but they were steady. They gave Eli the kind of upbringing that taught him resilience without bitterness and ambition without arrogance. His mother worked as a nurse, often arriving home with exhaustion under her eyes, but a gentle smile saved just for him. His father, a mechanic, taught him the value of working with his hands and solving problems patiently, determining that no task was too complicated as long as you approached it step by step. In many ways, that lesson shaped Eli far more than any school curriculum ever did. As a child, he wasn't the loudest or the most extraordinary in the room, not at first glance. He was the type of boy who listened before he spoke, who stepped back before stepping forward, who observed people closely and cared more deeply than he ever admitted. His teachers often remarked that he had an old soul, the kind kids usually grow into only after life teaches them a few harsh lessons. But Eli seemed to have been born with an innate tenderness, a softness that never made him weak, but instead made people gravitate toward him. The kind of tenderness that looked like remembering the birthdays of kids no one else bothered with, or sitting quietly with a classmate who'd been crying instead of running off to recess. Even in his early years, something about him felt grounded, as if he understood instinctively the things most people spend years figuring out. By high school, that quiet compassion had become a defining part of his identity. His grades were strong, not because he was naturally gifted in every subject, but because he pushed himself, understanding that a stable future wasn't guaranteed. His parents' sacrifices sharpened that awareness. He knew how many double shifts his mother pulled, how many evenings his father spent fixing other people's cars long after the shop closed. He didn't carry that as pressure, but as motivation. He wanted to build a life where he could repay their sacrifices, not in money, but in pride. And so he worked hard. He stayed late in study halls, took tutoring sessions he didn't always want but always needed, and joined the student volunteering club because he believed giving back wasn't a hobby, it was a responsibility. In his junior year, everything changed when a new girl transferred into his biology class, Lila Moreno. She was quiet too, but in a different way. Quiet like she was protecting herself. Quiet like she didn't trust the world to be gentle with her. Most people didn't look her way twice, but Eli noticed her. He noticed the way she picked at her pencil when she was nervous, the way she scanned the room before speaking as if expecting someone to interrupt or dismiss her, the way she walked quickly in hallways as though she wanted to be invisible and safe at the same time. Where others saw distance, Eli saw fear. And fear was something he believed no one should have to carry alone. Their connection didn't begin with sparks or romance, as most stories like to pretend. It began with a simple offer. If you need help with the lab, I can stay after class. Lila had looked at him like he was speaking another language. Not because she didn't understand him, but because she didn't understand why someone would offer her kindness without expecting something back. Eli, as always, didn't make a big deal of it. He stayed after class, walked her through the experiment, and didn't mention the way her hands trembled when she handled the beaker. That small act, unremarkable to some, became the first thread in a bond that would shape both of their futures. Over the months that followed, they became inseparable. Not in the dramatic teenage sense of clinging to each other every minute, but in the steady, natural way two complementary souls tend to merge. Lila found comfort in Eli's presence, the kind of comfort she never had at home. Her mother, Valerie, was strict, overbearing, and carried her own baggage that bled into her parenting. What began as concern often manifested as control, and what should have been guidance frequently slipped into manipulation. Lila grew up learning to shrink her desires, bite her tongue, and live small to keep the peace. Eli offered her a world where she was allowed to expand, allowed to laugh freely, allowed to feel safe. Beyond his relationship with Lila, Eli had ambitions that went far beyond the boundaries of their small community. He had been drawn to medicine since childhood, ever since a long hospital stay after a severe bout of pneumonia. While other children feared hospitals, Eli developed a fascination with the people inside them. The nurses who wiped his forehead gently, the doctor who explained each step to him patiently, the volunteers who brought him coloring books and small smiles when he needed them most. At 16, he told his parents he wanted to become a pediatric physician. His mother cried, not because she feared the challenge ahead of him, but because she had never seen her son speak with such clarity about his purpose. He applied to colleges with trembling hands, never entirely convinced he belonged in the places he dreamed of. But acceptance letters arrived one by one, and he ultimately chose a university near enough to home that he could visit often, but far enough that he felt the thrill of stepping into a future he'd carved himself. College suited him. His professors admired his willingness to ask questions, not for the sake of appearing intelligent, but to genuinely understand the mechanics of the human body and the fragile psychology that underpinned healing. He joined community programs that helped underprivileged kids prepare for medical school, offering tutoring sessions even when his own exams loomed. He never seemed stretched thin, because every part of what he did came from the same place, the desire to matter in a meaningful way. College also deepened his relationship with Lila. She attended a different school nearby, majoring in art therapy, a path inspired partly by her own experiences and partly by the soft encouragement Eli gave her every time she doubted her worth. They weren't the fireworks couple who flaunted their love online or made dramatic public displays. They were the couple who laughed at inside jokes while studying, who shared late-night talks about fear and future, who supported each other quietly but powerfully. Eli loved her with patience. Lila loved him with gratitude. And together, they created a world that felt far safer than the one Lila came from. But in every quiet love story, there's often a shadow lurking just outside the frame. For Eli and Lila, that shadow was Valerie Moreno. While she never openly forbade her daughter from seeing Eli, her coldness toward him was unmistakable. Subtle digs at his background, comments about his ambitions being too unrealistic, questions about his family's financial struggles, all delivered with the tone of someone disguising prejudice as maternal concern. Eli noticed, of course, but he never confronted Valerie. He said it wasn't his place. That one day, she'd see him for who he really was. Lila wasn't as optimistic. She carried the weight of her mother's disapproval and silent nods across her shoulders, knots that tightened each time she returned home after a date, each time she felt her mother's scrutinizing stare, each time Valerie turned kindness into a currency she expected repayment for. Still, despite the tension, Eli and Lila continued building their life. They spoke about moving in together, about traveling, about one day getting married after they established their careers. Eli had planned to speak to Valerie directly, hoping to mend the fractured relationship and prove his intentions were genuine. He believed people could change. He believed kindness could disarm even the coldest hearts. He believed giving Valerie a chance to understand him was the right path forward. What he didn't know was that Valerie's hostility wasn't rooted in misunderstanding. It was rooted in fear, ego, and a chilling, deep-seated belief that she alone knew what was best for her daughter. As his college workload intensified, Eli still made time for the people who mattered. He called his mother every Sunday morning, even when exhausted. He fixed his father's old toolbox when it started falling apart. He brought Lila soup when she came down with the flu and sat with her through the night while she slept, scrolling quietly on his phone to avoid waking her. He wasn't a saint, nor did he pretend to be. He had flaws, insecurities, moments of doubt just like anyone else. But those who knew him best remembered him as someone who never turned away from responsibility, who never took relationships for granted, and who never used his hardships as excuses. In the days leading up to his death, Eli had been particularly thoughtful, even anxious. Friends later recounted that he kept checking his phone, waiting for a call or message he didn't elaborate on. He spoke vaguely about a meeting he hoped would fix things once and for all, particularly between him and Lila's mother. He believed that bridging that divide would allow him and Lila to move forward freely. What he didn't admit aloud, perhaps even to himself, was that he sensed Valerie's resentment growing sharper, more pointed. But Eli was the type who walked into storms believing he could calm them. On the night before his death, he studied late, then sent Lila a message telling her he might finally have a breakthrough with her mom. He said he wanted to surprise her. He said he thought something good was about to happen. And in a cruel twist of fate, that optimism so characteristic of who he was became the very thread that led him to the trail where his life ended. Eli Turner's story wasn't defined by his death. It was defined by the years before it, the years spent nurturing relationships, dreams, and a future that now no one would ever see. His loss wasn't just the end of a life. It was the end of a potential, of the doctor he could have become, the husband he might have been, the father he would have undoubtedly excelled at being. It was the shattering of a legacy that was only just beginning to take shape. And yet, as heartbreaking as his end is, it becomes even more haunting when viewed through the lens of what comes next. Because understanding who Eli was is essential for understanding the cruelty that took him. When a life is built on kindness, humility, and hope, the injustice of its destruction casts a deeper shadow across every detail of the case. Eli Turner wasn't just a victim. He was a symbol of everything Valerie Moreno believed threatened her control. And that belief, twisted, fearful, and unchallenged, was about to ignite the investigation in ways no one could foresee. Families often look whole from the outside, their fractures hidden beneath polite smiles, holiday portraits, and the careful choreography of public behavior. The Moreno family was no exception. Anyone glancing at Valerie and Lila and passing at the grocery store, at community events, at church on Sundays would have seen what appeared to be a well-structured home, a composed mother, a quiet but respectful daughter, both dressed neatly, both polite, both seemingly aligned in their lives. But like many families shaped more by control than connection, the surface told nothing of the truth beneath. And the truth was that the Morenos were a family stitched together by tension, silence, and the unspoken belief that stability meant obedience rather than understanding. Valerie Moreno had built her identity around two things: the image she projected to the world and the strict set of expectations she imposed on her daughter. She was a woman who believed deeply in appearances, and the idea that people should strive not to be good, but to appear good, clean home, tidy clothes, proper manners, controlled emotions. She had grown up in a household where mistakes were punished harshly, where affection was given sparingly, and where love was conditional on performance. Instead of healing from that childhood, she carried its values forward like rigid commandments engraved into her bones. Valerie believed order created safety, and she believed anything outside that order, especially unpredictability, was a threat. Her marriage had been a casualty of that mindset. Years earlier, her husband had left, exhausted by her emotional distance and her refusal to let anyone else make decisions within the home. Their arguments had never been explosive. Instead, They were the quiet, suffocating kind where words were measured and walls built slowly. He had tried for years to connect with her, to soften the edges of a woman who had taught herself never to be vulnerable. But Valerie equated vulnerability with weakness and weakness with danger. When he finally walked away, leaving behind her daughter and a house full of unspoken tensions, Valerie convinced herself he had abandoned them not because of her rigidity, but because of his own failures. It was easier to believe she'd been wronged than to acknowledge that she had built a fortress no one could live inside. Lila, their only child, grew up learning to navigate her mother's unpredictable emotional climate. Valerie wasn't monstrous, nor was she outwardly cruel. Her harm was quieter, delivered through sharp glances, cold silences, and expectations that left no room for mistakes. Praise was rare, affection conditional, and boundaries rigid. Lila was taught how to behave long before she was taught how to feel. She learned early to swallow discomfort, to apologize quickly, to shrink herself whenever her mother's voice took on that clipped, disappointed tone that meant she'd failed some invisible test. By high school, Lila had become an expert at reading her mother's moods, something no daughter should ever have to become. She learned the subtle signs, the tightening of her mother's jaw, the shift in her posture, the deeper sigh that meant a lecture was coming. Even when Valerie wasn't speaking, her presence created a kind of pressure on the air, a demand that everyone fall in line with her expectations. And because Lila loved her mother, children always do. Even when love is complicated, she adapted, believing that compliance equaled harmony and harmony equaled love. But harmony in the Moreno household was fragile. It depended entirely on one thing: Lila doing exactly what her mother expected. Valerie's need for control didn't express itself loudly. Instead, it seeped into smaller things: what Lila wore, which friends she was allowed, what subjects she should pursue, when and how she should speak. Even the way she arranged items on her desk became a point of scrutiny. Lila lived within a narrow range of acceptable behavior, and stepping outside that range even slightly was treated as disobedience. So when Eli Turner entered the picture, Valerie's world shifted in ways she could not tolerate. She didn't despise Eli because he was unkind or irresponsible. He was neither. She didn't object because he treated Lila poorly. He did the opposite. Her issue wasn't who he was, but what he represented: independence, choice, influence. A person her daughter cared about deeply enough to listen to more than her mother. And that alone was enough to threaten the delicate control Valerie had maintained for years. From the very beginning, Valerie viewed Eli as a disruption. She noticed the lightness in Lila's steps when she returned from seeing him, the softness in her voice when she mentioned his name, the confidence that had begun to surface slowly after years of being buried beneath self-doubt. To most parents, that would have been a sign of healthy growth. But to Valerie, it was the first crack in the family portrait she had spent years constructing. Lila growing emotionally meant Lila might eventually grow away from her. And Valerie had invested too much of her identity in being the center of her daughter's world to let anyone, even someone kind, threaten that. Her early interactions with Eli were polite but stiff. She offered forced smiles, overly formal pleasantries, and a tone that suggested she was tolerating him only out of courtesy. Behind that facade, however, she was evaluating him through the meticulous, unforgiving lens she applied to everyone: his background, his upbringing, his family's income, his aspirations. She weighed each detail not based on merit, but based on whether they aligned with the future she had imagined for Lila. And no matter what Eli did, he failed her internal test. Not because he lacked qualities, but because he wasn't chosen by her, and control was the only love language Valerie understood. Lila sensed her mother's disapproval immediately. It hung in the air during dinners, tainted conversations, and lingered in the pauses between questions Valerie asked. Questions that looked harmless on the surface. How are your classes? Are you sure medicine is the right path? What do your parents think of your workload? But carried an undercurrent of skepticism aimed directly at Eli. He felt it too, the subtle way she dismissed him, the way she tightened her smile whenever he spoke, the way she made neutral statements sound like quiet accusations. But Eli being Eli, he tried to assume the best. He tried to win her over. He told Lila he understood her mother was protective, and that eventually he could show her how much he genuinely cared. Valerie, on the other hand, didn't want convincing. In her mind, it wasn't about whether Eli was a good person. It was about whether he belonged in the picture she'd crafted for her daughter's life. And that picture didn't include someone she hadn't chosen. Each time, Lila pushed back gently, cautiously, always trying to avoid conflict. Valerie pushed harder. She masked her objections as concern, cloaking her discomfort in statements like, "I just want what's best for you, and I'm only thinking about your future," even though her vision of best was rooted entirely in her own fears. Their home became a place of tension. Conversations became minefields. Lila learned to anticipate the way her mother's mood shifted whenever Eli was mentioned, and Eli learned that he needed to tread lightly. Yet neither understood the depth of Valerie's growing resentment. Lila hoped, as daughters often do, that her mother would eventually soften. Eli hoped kindness would eventually break through. But Valerie wasn't dealing with a simple dislike. She was dealing with a threat to her identity, a threat to her authority, a threat to the twisted belief she had long held, that only she knew what was best for Lila, and anyone else, even someone loving, could lead her astray. This resentment didn't explode at once. It built slowly, stacking like pressure beneath a fault line. A critical comment here, a dismissive remark there, a cold glance that lingered too long. But beneath those small moments lay something deeper and far more dangerous. Valerie's fear of losing her daughter entirely. Fear that Lila would eventually realize she didn't need her mother's approval for every choice. Fear that she would grow into the kind of woman who made decisions autonomously, without filtering them through Valerie's expectations. And perhaps the darkest part, though, Valerie would never admit it to herself, was that she envied her daughter's connection with Eli. She envied the softness he brought out in Lila, the laughter she hadn't heard from her daughter in years, the trust he inspired simply by being present. Valerie had spent years demanding loyalty through pressure. Eli earned it effortlessly through love. And jealousy is a quiet poison that rarely admits its name. Lila noticed the shift most when she began college. The distance granted her a taste of emotional freedom she had never known, and she began making decisions without her mother's oversight. She chose her classes. She chose her hobbies. She chose how she spent her evenings. Valerie felt this independence like a personal rejection, even though it was nothing more than a young woman growing into herself. Her control slipped, and she tightened her grip in response. She called more often. She asked intrusive questions. She criticized small choices that had nothing to do with her. And in the background of all this pressure was Eli, a constant presence, a source of comfort and empowerment for Lila, and a reminder to Valerie of everything she feared losing. As the months passed, conflict between mother and daughter became inevitable. Their arguments weren't explosive. Valerie rarely raised her voice. Instead, they were icy, heavy, and laced with passive-aggressive comments that left Lila feeling guilty, even when she'd done nothing wrong. Guilt, after all, was Valerie's most practiced weapon. And guilt was something Lila had been conditioned to absorb. It was during this growing tension that something inside Valerie shifted from control to paranoia. She began interpreting normal behavior as rebellion. Simple disagreements became personal attacks. Lila's happiness, especially when linked to Eli, became a threat Valerie believed she needed to neutralize. Not by violence, not at first, but by influence, manipulation, pressure. She attempted to turn Lila against him subtly. She planted doubts. She suggested ulterior motives. She minimized his accomplishments. She even hinted that he was using Lila as a stepping stone. None of it worked. Lila trusted Eli, and that trust was something Valerie could not tolerate. The fractured family portrait was crumbling, piece by piece. But the most chilling truth was this: Valerie didn't just dislike Eli. She feared him not because he posed real danger, but because he represented the possibility that Lila would finally escape her orbit. And people who fear losing control often take drastic measures to regain it. Measures that cross lines. Measures that cannot be undone. Measures that transform strained families into tragedies. Resentment rarely arrives like a storm. It grows slowly, quietly, almost politely, the way weeds creep across a garden until one day they choke everything that once bloomed there. Valerie Moreno's resentment toward Eli Turner didn't start as hatred. It didn't start as anger or cruelty or even conscious intent. It began as something far smaller, an uncomfortable tug deep within her whenever she saw her daughter smile at a message on her phone, or hurry to get ready for a date, or speak about the future in ways that didn't include her. That tug was the seed. And like all seeds, it waited for the right conditions to grow. Those conditions came not through Eli's actions, but through Valerie's memories, the ones she never confronted, never healed, never acknowledged as wounds. Her childhood had been a place where love was transactional. Her parents, strict and emotionally distant, believed praise made children weak. Perfection was the expectation, not the goal. Mistakes were met with silence or punishment, never compassion. Valerie grew up believing that love was something earned only by meeting impossible standards, and as an adult, she repeated what she knew. Control became her method of expressing care. Demands became her version of guidance. Fear, though she never admitted it, became her way of keeping the world predictable. But fear is a poor architect for a family. It builds brittle walls. It creates brittle relationships. And when life brings unexpected change, like a daughter falling in love with someone genuine, those brittle walls begin to crack. Valerie tried, for a time, to ignore the discomfort Eli stirred inside her. She told herself she was simply being protective, that all mothers worry about their daughters. She convinced herself that her critiques were reasonable, even necessary. But deep down, she sensed something she couldn't control. Lila was choosing someone else. Not over her, but alongside her, and that alone was enough to ignite something dark. Valerie had shaped her world around the belief that she alone was Lila's anchor. Without that identity, she felt unmoored, irrelevant, invisible. And invisibility frightened her more than anything. Resentment, once planted, began to grow roots that spread into every corner of her thoughts. She analyzed every detail of Eli's life, not to understand him, but to dismantle him. She judged his family's income with silent disdain, questioning whether someone from modest means could provide stability. She scrutinized his future goals, dismissing them as naive ambitions. She convinced herself that his kindness was manipulation, his ambition insecurity, his love for Lila a distraction from the path she believed her daughter should walk. None of this was true, but resentment has a way of warping reality, bending it until it fits the narrative someone is desperate to believe. It wasn't just Eli she resented. It was the version of Lila that emerged when he was around confident, expressive, hopeful. Valerie had spent years shaping her daughter to be careful, restrained, dependent. Eli was undoing that influence without even trying. He wasn't teaching Lila rebellion. He was teaching her self-worth. And for someone like Valerie, that was an unforgivable betrayal. She began to reframe her resentment into something more palatable: concern. Concern sounded noble. Concern sounded maternal. Concern could hide the truth even from herself. She told friends that she worried Eli was a distraction. She told coworkers that Lila wasn't focusing enough on her studies. She told herself that she was protecting her daughter from disappointment, heartbreak, instability. But beneath all these excuses was a quieter admission she was too ashamed to voice. She was afraid of being left behind. This fear grew heavier when Lila entered college, and the subtle independence she'd begun developing finally had space to take root. Valerie hated the distance, not just the physical separation, but the emotional one. Phone calls grew shorter. Dinner visits grew less frequent. And when they did talk, Lila seemed distracted, as though her life was expanding beyond the small, controlled world her mother had created. Valerie felt herself slipping from the center of her daughter's universe, and she reached desperately for anything that could pull her back. But desperation can twist a person. It can turn love into obsession, protection into possession. And Valerie's grip tightened around Lila, not because she wanted to nurture her, but because she wanted to keep her. Control had been her compass for so long that she didn't know how to love without it. As her resentment toward Eli deepened, small shifts began to reveal the shape of something dangerous forming inside her. She monitored Lila's social media more closely, searching for signs of changes she disapproved of. She began making backhanded comments framed as jokes, comments that jabbed at Eli while appearing harmless. She subtly suggested Lila focus more on school, less on relationships. She even mentioned other boys, imaginary ones, who were more focused, more stable, more appropriate. When those tactics failed, she tried guilt. Guilt was familiar. Guilt had worked on Lila for years. But guilt began to lose its power the more Lila stepped into her autonomy. She still loved her mother, still cared about her opinion, but she was no longer trapped inside the small box Valerie had once built around her. That freedom, however fragile, was intoxicating, and Valerie could see it in her daughter's eyes each time she returned home. Light, independence, possibility. The more Lila grew, the more Valerie felt herself shrinking. And nothing frightened her more than insignificance. The resentment began shaping itself into justification. Valerie convinced herself that Eli was the source of all this change. She told herself he was pulling Lila away, that he was manipulating her, that he was sabotaging her future. These beliefs weren't grounded in reality. They were born from insecurity. But once Valerie accepted them as truth, she began seeing Eli through the most distorted lens imaginable, as an enemy. Enemies threaten. Enemies deceive. Enemies must be eliminated, not through violence, not yet, but through influence and pressure and emotional manipulation. Valerie began planning conversations meant to seed doubt in Lila's mind. She exaggerated concerns, spun small disagreements into warnings, turned quiet opinions into dire predictions. When that failed, she tried to involve Eli directly, creating scenarios where she could criticize him under the guise of offering advice. But Eli, patient and respectful, never fought back. And that infuriated her more. His calmness, his politeness, his quiet dignity, they left her with no ammunition. She couldn't accuse him of disrespect. She couldn't claim he was irresponsible. He gave her no cracks to exploit. And a person with no cracks is impossible to shatter, unless you create the cracks yourself. The turning point, though subtle, was unmistakable in hindsight. One evening, Lila returned home later than expected. Valerie sat waiting in the kitchen, lights dimmed, posture rigid, eyes narrowed with wounded authority. She asked simple questions with dangerous undertones. Why didn't you text? Why didn't you call? Who were you with? Lila answered honestly, explaining she'd been talking with Eli, losing track of time, laughing, sharing stories. And something in that answer broke Valerie's restraint. Not outwardly. She didn't scream. She didn't slam doors. She didn't accuse. Instead, she delivered a quiet, calculated line that startled even Lila. If he really loved you, he wouldn't keep you away from me. It was the first time Valerie framed Eli as someone actively harming their relationship. And once she allowed herself to believe that narrative, her resentment evolved into something far more pointed: blame. Blame is easier than introspection. Blame is easier than growth. Blame gives people permission to act on their fears. From that moment on, Valerie's perception of Eli shifted entirely. Every action he took became proof of her theory. If he didn't visit their home enough, she said he was avoiding her because he knew she saw through him. If he visited often, she said he was trying too hard to manipulate their trust. If Lila smiled when talking about him, she said he was distracting her. If Lila cried after an argument with her mother, she said Eli was causing her distress. He became the culprit of every unhappiness, every tension, every crack in the household. And once Valerie convinced herself that Eli was the enemy, her resentment bloomed fully into a dangerous conviction. She believed she had to protect her daughter from him. Not protect her from harm. There was no harm. Protect her from independence. Protect her from growth. Protect her from a future Valerie couldn't control. That kind of protection is a mask that often hides the darkest impulses. It was only a matter of time before Valerie decided that sabotage wasn't enough. That guilt wasn't enough. That influence wasn't enough. Resentment had turned into fear. Fear had turned into obsession. And obsession, left unchecked, often turns into a decision that redraws lives in irreversible ways. Valerie was nearing that decision, even if she didn't yet recognize it. The seeds of resentment she had allowed to grow were becoming roots, and those roots were quietly tightening around the fate of everyone involved. There are nights that change nothing, blending into the soft blur of memory without leaving a mark. And then there are nights that split a life cleanly in two, everything before it and everything after. For Eli Turner, the night he agreed to meet Valerie Moreno would become the dividing line he never saw coming, one he stepped across willingly, driven not by fear or desperation, but by hope. Hope that he could finally mend what had been fractured. Hope that love, honesty, and patience might bridge the distance between him and the woman who had never wanted him near her daughter. That hope, tragically, would be the very thing exploited against him. In the week leading up to the meeting, Eli had sensed a shift in Valerie's behavior. Subtle, unexpected, almost disorienting. Lila had mentioned that her mother seemed calmer, less confrontational, even polite when Eli's name came up. Valerie had started sending brief, neatly worded messages. Would like to talk. Just us. Important. The tone was sharp but not hostile, formal but not cold. For the first time, she appeared willing to communicate without accusation. Lila, cautiously optimistic, encouraged Eli to accept the invitation. She wanted to believe that her mother was ready to compromise, ready to see the goodness she saw so clearly in him. Eli, always hopeful, agreed. He told himself that this was progress. That Valerie reaching out was a sign of emotional growth, even vulnerability. That if he could just sit with her, face to face, and show her who he truly was, not the projections of her fears, not the version she invented out of insecurity, then things would finally turn. He hoped to ease the pressure Lila had been living under, hoped to prove he wasn't a threat to Valerie's role in her daughter's life. And so he said yes, with that gentle optimism he carried everywhere he went. But Valerie's motivations had nothing to do with truth or healing. Her message had been crafted with precision, not sincerity. It was the product of weeks of spiraling thoughts, of late-night pacing, of whispered conversations with herself where she recited twisted reasons for why she needed to protect her daughter at any cost. In her mind, this meeting was not a gesture of reconciliation. It was an opportunity, a final chance to reassert control, to confront the person she saw as the architect of her slipping authority, to regain the power she believed Eli had stolen simply by loving her daughter. On the afternoon of the meeting, the sky hung low with soft clouds, and the world felt unusually quiet. Eli finished a study session at the library, packing his notes with a sort of absent-minded focus. His friends had noticed his nerves earlier, a subtle stiffness in his smile. the way he kept checking the time, but he brushed off their concerns with reassuring words. "It's just a conversation," he said. "Nothing dramatic. She just wants to talk." They wished him luck. One even joked that if Valerie didn't like him after this, she never would. Eli laughed. He didn't know that those would be the last friendly voices he'd hear. He stopped by a cafe on his way, buying a tea for himself and a coffee for Valerie, her usual order, the one he'd learned through Lila's offhand mentions. A small gesture, perhaps, but meaningful. He wanted to show respect, kindness, willingness. He believed those things could soften hearts, even hardened ones. With the drinks in hand, he walked the familiar streets toward the overlooked trail where Valerie had requested they meet, a place she said was peaceful enough for an honest discussion. The trail was quiet by the time he arrived, wrapped in the dimming light of dusk. The sky above was turning a gentle shade of lavender, the kind that makes the world feel softer. Birds called to each other in the trees. The faint hum of ocean waves drifted through the cool air. Eli paused for a moment, taking in the scene. He wondered if, perhaps, this setting was Valerie's attempt at lowering the emotional temperature. Maybe she wanted a calm environment. Maybe this truly was a step forward. He didn't yet see her. Valerie stood several yards off the trail, partially hidden by brush, watching him approach. Her posture was rigid, her expression unreadable, her breath shallow. She had arrived early, much earlier than she told him, because preparation was essential to her. She had rehearsed this conversation repeatedly, shaping every word, every angle of blame. But beneath her meticulously constructed speeches was something far more powerful. Panic. Panic that her daughter was slipping away. Panic that Eli represented a future where she no longer held authority. Panic that, once Lila was fully independent, Valerie would be left alone with her unresolved fears and a life she no longer recognized. As Eli stepped closer, he finally spotted her. He smiled, offering the coffee, trying to break the tension with warmth. But Valerie didn't take it. She didn't smile back. Her eyes flicked to the cup briefly, not in gratitude, but in calculation, measuring his intentions, weighing his actions, searching for hidden motives where none existed. The air between them tightened. "Thank you for meeting me," Eli began, voice steady despite his nerves. "I know this isn't easy. I just want us to understand each other better." Valerie didn't respond at first. She merely turned, gesturing for him to follow her off the trail, toward a clearing near the cliff's edge where the ocean stretched endlessly. Eli hesitated, just for a second, before following. It wasn't fear holding him back. It was uncertainty. She was quieter than usual, still, almost eerily composed. But he brushed off the feeling, reminding himself that people act strangely when confronting difficult emotions. The clearing was still. The wind, though present, felt muted. The world seemed to hold its breath. When Valerie finally spoke, her voice was low, layered with forced calm. "You've changed her," she said. "My daughter. She's not the same." Eli exhaled slowly, nodding. "I think she's growing, becoming more confident. That's a good thing. Me, she's slipping away." Valerie's voice cut through his sentence like a blade. "She's not slipping away," Eli replied gently. "She loves you. She always has, but she's learning to make choices for herself. That's part of growing up." "Growing up?" Valerie snapped, her composure cracking at the edges. "Growing up means respecting the people who raised her, not abandoning them for strangers. I'm not trying to replace you," Eli said softly. "I'm just trying to be part of her life. We can all exist together." But Valerie wasn't listening, not truly. His words drifted through the air without reaching her. She didn't hear his sincerity, his patience, or his genuine desire for harmony. She heard only threat, loss, failure. Everything she feared condensed into a voice too kind for the conclusion she'd drawn. "What happens when she chooses you over me?" Valerie asked, her eyes glinting with a kind of desperation Eli had never seen. What happens when she moves out? When she stops calling? When I'm left alone? Eli stepped forward slightly, hands open, voice calm. She won't abandon you. She loves you more than you know. I'm not taking her away. Yes, you are. Valerie's voice trembled. Maybe not intentionally, but you are. Eli swallowed, sensing the rising storm. Then let me fix this, he said quietly. Let's talk honestly. Let's find a way to make this work. For Lila. But Valerie shook her head slowly, as if his words arrived too late. As if the script in her mind had already concluded, long before he opened his mouth. She took a step back, her eyes narrowing not with hatred, but with something far more dangerous. Conviction. You don't understand, she whispered. You can't. You think you're helping her, but you're destroying everything I built. Eli's breath tightened. Valerie, please, let's calm down and talk. But Valerie wasn't calming down. She was unraveling. All the boundaries between fear and reality had blurred, and the clearing became the final stage for a decision she believed she had to make. Her hand trembled as she reached inside her coat. Eli froze. Valerie, he said softly, carefully, whatever you're thinking, don't. Please. We can fix this. I promise. But she wasn't thinking. She was spiraling, convinced, consumed by the belief that eliminating Eli meant reclaiming Lila, that taking this step meant restoring order. The gun appeared in her hand like an unwelcome revelation. Eli stepped back, breath fracturing, eyes wide not in anger, but in heartbreak. Valerie, he whispered, voice cracking, you don't have to do this. This isn't you. But Valerie had crossed a mental threshold long before the meeting even began. This moment, in her mind, was the culmination of weeks, years even, of fear and desperation. I'm doing what any mother would do, she said. No, Eli breathed. Not any mother. Please. The first shot pierced the air before he could say anything more. The second ended the future he never got to finish. And as the echo faded into the cliffside, carried away by the indifferent wind, the clearing returned to its unnatural stillness, its silence broken only by the trembling breath of a woman who had convinced herself she was saving her daughter, even as she destroyed everything Lila loved. Valerie stood frozen, staring down at what she had done, not with horror, but with the numbness of someone who has severed the last tether to reason. Then she placed the gun beside him, carefully, almost ceremonially, as if arranging evidence for a story she wanted the world to believe. And as the sky shifted fully into night, the only person who knew the truth of that meeting was the one who would never speak again. In every murder investigation, there comes a moment when grief must give way to clarity, when the weight of loss must be set aside long enough for truth to surface. For Detective Aaron Delaney, that moment came the morning after Eli Turner's autopsy, as he stood alone in the dimly lit evidence room, reviewing the early findings with a heaviness that settled deep behind his ribs. He wasn't new to death, far from it, but some cases cling to investigators in ways that feel personal, even if they shouldn't. Eli's death was one of those cases. The stillness of the young man's face, the arrangement of the body, the strange tidiness of the crime scene, none of it aligned with the senseless violence Delaney had seen over his 16 years in homicide. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography. It wasn't rage. It was calculation. And calculations leave trails if you know where to look. The first hours after the body was discovered were filled with the predictable flurry of police activity. But as the initial dust began to settle, patterns emerged in the background noise. Eli's phone data, retrieved and backed up before being locked into evidence, revealed the final text he'd been composing. A message addressed to Lila. She said she wants to... It ended abruptly, mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-breath. For Delaney, that fragment was more than just an unfinished message. It was the final breadcrumb, a breadcrumb pointing not to a stranger, but to someone close, someone trusted, someone whose request for a meeting would not have raised suspicion. Delaney replayed that truth in his mind repeatedly, letting it settle like dust across the file. The final hours of Eli's life had not been spontaneous. They had been arranged, coordinated, and the only person besides Lila who had tension, conflict, and motive woven into Eli's life was Valerie Moreno. But motive alone was never enough. Motive was the spark. Evidence was the fire. And so, the investigation began to branch outward, tracing the shadows surrounding Valerie's life and the path she walked in the hours leading up to the crime. While half the team pulled phone records, surveillance tapes, and credit card logs, Delaney and his partner, Detective Mia Rourke, returned to the trail where Eli's body had been found. The morning fog still clung to the ground, curling around the yellow tape that fluttered quietly in the breeze. Mia crouched near the faint shoe print the forensics team had flagged the previous day. It was light or smaller, consistent with either a petite adult or older child. Valerie was small, her frame compact, her steps notoriously quiet according to neighbors. But it wasn't enough to confirm anything not yet. "Could be a jogger," Mia said, brushing her gloved fingers near the indentation, careful not to disturb it. "Could be," Delaney replied quietly, though his gut told him otherwise. But joggers don't usually walk this close to the brush. They stick to the trail. Whoever made this print stepped off path for a reason. And the weapon? "Wiped clean," Delaney said. "No prints. No DNA. Nothing. Convenient. Too convenient." They stood there a moment longer, letting the wind carry the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. The ocean felt indifferent, almost cruelly calm. "If she did this," Mia murmured, "why leave the gun behind?" Delaney exhaled slowly. "Because she wants a narrative to emerge. Whoever staged this scene wanted it investigated a certain way. The question is, what story is she hoping we believe? The absence of clear struggle marks, the placement of the weapon, the lack of defensive wounds, the calm positioning of the body. All small details, but together, they painted a picture. This wasn't a spontaneous killing. It was a controlled moment, a planned moment, and perhaps, in the killer's eyes, a justified one. By mid-afternoon, the lab results began trickling in. Ballistics confirmed the gun found beside Eli was the murder weapon, a standard 9mm registered years ago to a man who had since moved out of state and reported it stolen 3 years earlier. That report had never been resolved. But the resurfacing of the weapon now at this scene raised more questions than answers. Meanwhile, cell tower data placed Eli's phone near the coastal trail between 7:42 p.m. and 8:09 p.m. Valerie's phone, however, appeared to have been powered off around 6:50 p.m. and turned on again shortly after 9 p.m. That window was suspicious. People accidentally let batteries die. People forgot their chargers. But Valerie wasn't careless. Every neighbor, every colleague, every coworker interviewed described her as meticulous, almost obsessively so. The kind of person who never lost her keys, never misplaced important items, never let her phone drop below 50% battery without plugging it in. A sudden 3-hour window of silence from her device was, at best, unusual. At worst, intentional. Delaney stared at the record sheet for a long moment. Shadows were forming around Valerie, but shadows still weren't evidence. He needed something concrete. By evening, a discovery arrived not through forensic labs or data logs, but from an unexpected witness, a local man who walked the cliff trails every evening with his elderly terrier. He came to the station voluntarily after seeing news of the murder, explaining he might have witnessed something odd the previous night. He described a small, dark-colored sedan parked near the trail entrance around dusk, engine off, interior dark, a single figure inside. He didn't see the person clearly, only that the figure sat rigid, staring straight ahead. He noticed it only because the car wasn't familiar to him, and at that hour the lot was usually empty. "What time?" Delaney asked. "Somewhere around 7:15, the man replied. "Maybe 7:20. "And when did you leave the area?" "Closer to 8 o'clock, maybe a little after." "And the car?" "Still there." Eli's timeline placed him entering the trail around 7:40. The car being there both before and after fit the window of a waiting murderer. When asked if he could identify the vehicle, the man shook his head. But he remembered something else, something small but vital. "The person inside," he said slowly, "had their hands on the steering wheel the whole time, not moving, not on their phone. Just waiting. Waiting." The word hit Delaney harder than expected. He thanked the witness, released him, and went to the whiteboard in the conference room where they had begun mapping the case. He drew a circle around the timeline, then wrote one word beside the sightings: premeditation. Meanwhile, the digital forensics team found something else, small, almost insignificant, but important. Valerie's GPS history from earlier in the day showed she had navigated to a gas station near the coastal trail, stopping for only 3 minutes before leaving. Enough time to buy water or fuel. Or, perhaps, enough time to ensure she had the supplies she needed for a staged meeting. Still, suspicion wasn't proof. They needed a link, hard evidence tying her to the path Eli walked that night. That link arrived in the form of a surveillance camera mounted on a local business facing the road toward the trail. At exactly 7:38 p.m., a vehicle that matched the description of Valerie's car, same make, same model, same dent on the rear bumper, was filmed driving toward the trailhead. The image wasn't crystal clear. The angle was bad, the lighting dim, but it was enough to warrant deeper scrutiny. As the investigation expanded, so did the tension. Valerie had not yet been brought in for questioning, not officially. Delaney knew rushing the process could give her time to craft stories, cover tracks, prepare an emotional performance. He needed to approach her with precision, the same precision she used to orchestrate the meeting. But before he spoke to Valerie, he needed to speak to Lila again. The second interview with her was softer, gentler. She was grieving, shattered, and yet still willing to help, still searching for answers. But as the conversation deepened, something unintentional slipped from her mouth, something that made Delaney's pulse quicken. She mentioned a small argument she'd had with her mother the afternoon before the murder. Something about letting go. Something about choices. Something about ruining the future. They weren't details that incriminated Valerie directly, but they painted a clear emotional landscape, one filled with tension, fear, and the kind of desperation that could push a person past their limits. After the interview, Lila broke down completely, exhausted by the weight of what she feared but could not bring herself to say aloud. Delaney stayed with her until she calmed, his expression unreadable, carrying the tragic understanding that the answers she dreaded were walking steadily toward her with or without her permission. As midnight approached, the board was covered in timelines, maps, witness statements, and fragmented pieces of truth. Nothing explicitly screamed guilty, but the shadows were no longer subtle. They were forming the outline of a woman whose fear of losing control had metastasized into something irreversible. The final piece that sealed the direction of the investigation came from Eli's phone, the last outgoing call made before his death. A call to Valerie's number at 7:22 p.m. and a voicemail Valerie never mentioned. Delaney listened with headphones, eyes narrowing as Eli's voice trembled gently through the static. "Hi, Valerie. I'm on my way. I hope we can talk honestly tonight, for Lila's sake. I want this to be a good thing. I think it can be. It wasn't evidence of murder, but it was evidence of a lie, her lie. She knew about the meeting. She arranged it. She invited him. And she pretended she hadn't. That was the crack Delaney needed. The shadows were no longer abstract. They had shape, direction, identity. Valerie Moreno's. and the trail of truth was now leading straight to her doorstep. Grief changes a person. It reshapes the way they speak, the way they occupy space, the way they look at themselves in the mirror. But guilt rearranges something far deeper. It warps the inner structure of a life until nothing fits the way it once did. In the days following Eli Turner's death, Lila Moreno found herself carrying both grief and guilt like twin weights she didn't have the strength to hold, yet couldn't put down. She moved through her daily routines like someone walking underwater slow, disoriented, disconnected from the world's normal tempo. Every sound felt muted. Every place felt wrong. Every breath felt borrowed. At first, no one expected her to talk. People respect silence after tragedy. They treat it like a fragile container that might shatter if handled too harshly. Friends sent messages she couldn't read. Professors extended deadlines she didn't remember missing. Her college counselor left her 3 voicemails, each softer than the last. But even in this collective gentleness, an invisible clock was ticking. Investigators needed answers. Detectives needed clarity. And Lila, whether she felt ready or not, was becoming the gravitational center of the case, not because she wanted to be, but because she was the only person standing between truth and denial. She spent most of her time alone in her dorm room. The lights dimmed, curled beneath a blanket that still faintly smelled like Eli's cologne from the night he draped it over her shoulders during a movie. She hadn't washed it. She couldn't. The scent made her chest tight, but losing it felt worse. His absence was everywhere. In the missing good morning texts, in the empty seat at their café, in the silence that no longer felt peaceful. Every small reminder became a wound reopening. Valerie, meanwhile, haunted the edges of Lila's pain like a careful shadow, never far, never fully present, always watching. She maintained a performance of concern, calling every morning, stopping by her dorm unexpectedly with food she claimed Lila needed, crafting an image of a devoted mother supporting a grieving daughter. To outsiders, she played the role flawlessly. But to Lila, something about her mother's sudden tenderness felt wrong, off, too deliberate, too rehearsed. It wasn't that Valerie had never been caring before she had, in her own rigid way. But this was different. It was the kind of sweetness that tasted artificial, the kind that made Lila's instincts prick uncomfortably. Detective Delaney sensed it too. The more he spoke with Lila, the more he noticed how her voice faltered whenever her mother's name came up, how she avoided eye contact, how she seemed to be wrestling with questions she was afraid to ask aloud. Trauma clouds judgment, yes, but it also exposes truths people spent years trying to bury. And Lila, without realizing it, was beginning to unravel the edges of Valerie's facade. During the second interview, she hesitated before speaking, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt, a nervous habit Delaney had observed before. When he asked her about the last conversation she had with her mother, she paused so long that he thought she might refuse to answer. But then her voice broke through, fragile and trembling. She said she wanted things to go back to how they used to be. Delaney leaned forward slightly. What do you think she meant by that? I don't know. Lila shook her head, eyes welling. Maybe she meant before college, before Eli, before I grew up. What did you say to her? I told her that things can't go backward, that I'm trying to build my own life. She didn't take it well. Lila swallowed hard. She said I was making decisions without thinking, that I was letting someone else influence me. She meant Eli. She always meant Eli. There was a pause, long and heavy. And how did Eli feel about that? He wanted to fix it. A tiny broken smile flickered across her lips. He always wanted to fix things, even when they weren't his fault. Her voice cracked. She covered her face with her hands. Delaney gave her a moment, then another. When she finally looked up, tears streaking across her cheeks, she whispered the sentence that shifted the entire investigation. He was going to talk to her. He thought, He thought if he talked to her face to face, she'd see he cared about me, that she'd accept us someday. I told him to be careful. I told him she'd never understand. But he wanted to try anyway. The room felt colder after that confession. Not because of the words themselves, but because of the tone, the trembling dread beneath them. Lila knew something wasn't right. She had felt it. She had feared it. And she had ignored that fear because she trusted her mother, even when her instincts screamed otherwise. It was during this moment of painful honesty that something inside Lila began to crack. Not her grief, but the silence she had been holding around her mother. Silence built over years of conditioning, guilt, and emotional manipulation. Silence that protected Valerie even when she didn't deserve protection. Silence that had prevented Lila from acknowledging the truth forming in her chest, a truth she'd been too terrified to articulate, that her mother was capable of harm. That crack widened further the following evening, not because of anything Delaney said, but because of a conversation Lila unintentionally overheard. Valerie had come to her dorm again, insisting on checking in, but Lila had stepped out briefly to take a call from a friend. When she returned to her hallway, she heard her mother's voice drifting through the slightly ajar door tents, whispering, frantic, "They won't find anything. Stop worrying. I told you to trust me. Just keep quiet and everything will settle soon." Lila froze. The voice on the other end, whose identity she could not hear, responded in muffled tones, agitated. Valerie's reply was sharper this time, tinged with annoyance. "Calm down. I said it's handled. Handled." The word lanced through Lila like a cold blade. Her breath stuttered. She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. Her mother rarely spoke like this, urgent, conspiratorial, almost reprimanding. And the timing, the secrecy, the tone. A horrifying thought flickered at the edge of her mind. She stepped back quietly, heart pounding so violently she could hear it in her ears. She didn't confront her mother then. Fear held her tongue. But something in her shifted permanently. Doubt bloomed where trust once lived. Suspicion thrived where comfort had been. And with each hour that passed, the questions she'd been too afraid to entertain began taking shape with terrifying clarity. That night she barely slept. She sat at her desk, the blanket Eli gave her wrapped tightly around her shoulders, staring at the wall until sunrise. Memories replayed in loops. Valerie's hostility toward Eli, her controlling nature, her sudden shift to kindness. The way she never liked him. The way she never wanted them together. The missing hours from Valerie's timeline. The voicemail. The coldness in her voice on the phone. By morning, the silence inside Lila had broken completely. She called Detective Delaney herself. Her voice was quiet but steady. I think my mother lied to you." Those words were the beginning of truth. Not the whole truth. Not yet. Not even close. But they were enough. Enough to guide Delaney toward a crucial shift in the case. Enough to dismantle Valerie's carefully curated narrative. Enough to give Lila the courage to confront the questions she'd buried for so long. When Valerie found out her daughter had spoken to the detective, again without her knowledge, her reaction wasn't grief, wasn't worry. It was fury masked as concern. She arrived at Lila's dorm demanding explanations, her face tight, her tone sharp. She accused the detectives of manipulating Lila, accused Lila of being emotionally unstable, accused the world of trying to tear their family apart. But Lila, shaking, fragile, terrified, finally raised her voice. "Mom, what did you do?" Valerie froze. For the first time in her life, Lila watched her mother lose control of her expression. Just for a split second. Just long enough. That microsecond of fear of being revealed was all Lila needed to see. The cracks in the silence had become fractures. And what poured through them was something raw, undeniable, and devastating. The truth. That her mother had something to hide. Something she could not explain away. something she feared Lila discovering more than anything else. And in that realization, the emotional chain that had bound Lila to her mother for years finally began to break. The truth was coming. The confrontation was inevitable. The investigation was about to explode. And Valerie Moreno would no longer be able to outrun the shadows she had created. The morning of the arrest began with a strange stillness, the kind that settles over a town right before something irreversible happens. Detective Delaney felt it the moment he stepped out of his car. The air was cool, unnaturally quiet, as if even the birds understood that they carried weight. After Lila's call, after the fractured confession hidden in her trembling voice, the case had shifted with a suddenness that left no room for hesitation. Valerie Moreno was no longer a peripheral figure orbiting suspicion. She was now the gravitational center pulling every thread of evidence toward her. The team gathered before sunrise, briefing in low tones, reviewing the timeline, the inconsistencies, the surveillance angle, the phone records, the voicemail, and most damning of all, the daughter whose voice cracked under the strain of trying to believe her mother was innocent. The threshold between suspicion and certainty had been crossed. It was time. Delaney insisted on being the one to make the arrest, not out of pride, but out of responsibility. He had seen too many cases mishandled by officers who treated suspects like trophies instead of human beings. And Valerie, despite everything, was still human. Dangerous, yes. Deceptive, absolutely. But human nonetheless, full of delusions she believed were truths, fears she believed were logic, and a love for her daughter so twisted it had collapsed into something unrecognizable. He didn't know what state she would be in when they confronted her. Defensive, calm, explosive, broken. But he sensed she was nearing a precipice. One false move, and she might try to destroy the last evidence of what she'd done. Not physical evidence, but emotional evidence. Her influence over Lila. They approached her house in silence, the early light casting long shadows down the narrow street. Valerie's home looked painfully ordinary: white siding, trimmed bushes, a porch wind chime that tapped gently against the breeze. It was the kind of home where neighbors imagined warm dinners and quiet evenings. The kind where mothers kept calendars on refrigerators and daughters did homework at the kitchen table. But Delaney knew better than to trust appearances. Evil didn't always hide in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes it smiled from doorsteps and volunteered at school bake sales. Sometimes it lived inside the walls people least suspected. Valerie answered the door without hesitation, wearing a slate gray sweater and an expression so composed it bordered on chilling. She didn't look surprised to see officers on her porch. She didn't ask questions. For a moment, Delaney wondered if she had been expecting them. Her face was unreadable calm, too calm, like someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind over and over until it no longer frightened her. Only her eyes betrayed her. They flickered with something sharp, something defensive, something knowing. "Good morning, Mrs. Moreno," Delaney said, his tone steady. "May we speak with you?" She stepped aside with a mechanical politeness, gesturing for them to enter. The living room was immaculate, each cushion perfectly aligned, each surface wiped to a sterile sheen. Valerie stood near the edge of the couch, hands clasped neatly, posture upright. She looked like a woman preparing for a business interview, not someone about to be confronted with the unraveling of a murder. Delaney began gently. "We've continued investigating Eli Turner's death. We have new information we need to discuss with you." Valerie nodded once, expression smooth. "Of course. I've been fully cooperative." The word cooperative landed with a weight Delaney didn't miss. He watched her closely as he continued. "We know about the meeting," he said. "The one you arranged with him." For the first time, a crack appeared, subtle but unmistakable. Valerie blinked slowly, deliberately, like someone trying to maintain composure while recalibrating her narrative. "I don't know what you mean," she said. I never met with him. I told you that already. Delaney remained calm. Mrs. Moreno, we recovered a voicemail Eli left you the night he died. He said he was on his way to meet you. Silence stretched across the room, taut and fragile. Valerie's jaw tightened. The temperature seemed to drop by a degree. I didn't listen to my voicemails that night, she replied. Too quickly. I was overwhelmed. But Delaney wasn't finished. We also have surveillance footage placing your vehicle near the trail shortly before he arrived. And your phone was powered off for nearly 3 hours during that time. For a heartbeat, Valerie didn't breathe. Her eyes darted, just slightly, toward the hallway where Lila's childhood bedroom stood, an instinctive glance, a subconscious betrayal of priorities. Delaney saw it. He understood what it meant. Her biggest fear in that moment wasn't arrest. It was exposure. Exposure to her daughter. Exposure to herself. When she finally spoke, her voice quivered with a mixture of anger and despair. I was trying to help her, she whispered. She was losing herself. He was pulling her away. I had to protect her. I had to do something. The confession was unintentional. A slip. A truth leaking from a crack she couldn't seal fast enough. Delaney stepped forward slowly. Mrs. Moreno, I need you to listen to me, he said, voice low. Helping your daughter doesn't justify harming someone else. And whatever you intended that night, the fact is, Eli didn't walk away. Valerie's breath hitched. Her fingers curled into fists. He was ruining her future, she murmured, almost to herself. She was slipping away from me. I couldn't let that happen. Delaney took one more step. Valerie, you're under arrest for the murder of Eli Turner. The words struck the room like thunder. Valerie's composure, held together by years of practiced control, finally shattered. She staggered back a step, shaking her head rapidly, as if trying to physically dislodge the truth from her mind. Her voice rose first in panic, then fury. No, you don't understand. I did the right thing. I saved her. I saved her. She's my daughter. My daughter. The officers moved in gently, placing restraints on her wrists. Valerie didn't fight, not physically. Her resistance was entirely emotional, a torrent of denial, desperation, and warped justification spilling out in frantic waves. As she was escorted out of the house, neighbors began peering through windows, murmuring in confusion, then shock. Valerie Moreno, the composed, respectable, ever-present mother who kept her garden perfect and her schedule precise, was being placed in the back of a patrol car. And as the door closed, the illusion of her carefully curated life closed with it. Inside the station, Lila waited in a small, windowed room, unaware of the moment unfolding outside. Delaney hesitated before entering. He knew what he was about to bring into her world would break something inside her forever, the kind of break that doesn't heal cleanly. When he finally stepped inside, Lila looked up, eyes swollen with exhaustion, voice barely a whisper. Did you find something else? Delaney sat across from her, hands folded. We arrested your mother this morning. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lila didn't gasp. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She simply stared at him, unblinking, as though her mind needed time to catch up to the words. Her throat tightened. Her fingers trembled. Her breath hitched. And then she whispered the truth she had feared all along. I knew it. I didn't want to believe it. But I knew. The tears that followed were not the tears of disbelief, but the tears of betrayal, raw, catastrophic, soul-deep. The kind of betrayal that forces a person to question every memory, every hug, every moment of supposed love. And as morning sunlight spilled through the blinds, harsh and uninvited, Lila understood something that would haunt her forever. The person who had claimed to love her more than anyone else had committed the most unforgivable act in the name of that love. Her world didn't just break, it split cleanly in two, before the truth. And after it. The courtroom was already full before the doors officially opened. A sea of murmurs and shifting bodies packed into every bench, every corner, every strip of standing room against the back wall. Trials like this, where grief, betrayal, and community tension collided, had a way of drawing people like magnets. Reporters lined the hallway, their camera lights flickering like restless fireflies, eager to capture every sliver of emotion from a town divided between sympathy and shock. Inside the courtroom, sunlight filtered through tall windows, drawing pale rectangles across the floor, illuminating dust that drifted lazily in the still air. It was a deceptively peaceful scene, layered over an atmosphere charged with silent dread. Because today was not about spectacle. Today was about truth, ugly, painful, irreversible truth. Lila sat near the front, hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned colorless. She didn't look at her mother at first. Couldn't. Valerie sat at the defendant's table in a light blouse and blazer, her hair neatly brushed, her posture stiff, almost regal. If anyone had walked into the room without context, they might have mistaken her for the attorney rather than the accused. She had always been composed, always meticulous. Even now, facing the consequences of something unimaginable, she clung to that last piece of herself. But her eyes betrayed her. They darted toward Lila with a blend of desperation, longing, and something darker, an obsession masquerading as maternal love. Lila felt that gaze like a hand tightening around her throat. Eli's family entered quietly from the side door, settling into the seats reserved for them. His mother clutched a folded tissue as though it were the last fragile link to her son. His father stared straight ahead, jaw tight, refusing to let pain become visible. There was a hollow look to them both, an exhaustion that went beyond grief, an exhaustion born from months of waiting, weeks of evidence, days of reliving their son's last moments. The courtroom held its breath as they took their seats. Every eye followed them, every heart twisted. When the judge finally entered, commanding silence with the simple lift of a gavel, the room shifted. This was no longer a gathering of onlookers. This was the battleground of truth. The prosecution began by laying out the timeline methodically, carefully, with a precision designed to leave no cracks for doubt. Photos of the coastal trail, the recovered voicemail, the surveillance footage, Valerie's extended silence on the night of the murder, the inconsistencies in her statement, the witnesses who had seen her car idling near the trailhead. Each piece of evidence was a rope tightening around the facade Valerie had built. And yet, she remained expressionless, sipping water occasionally, eyes fixed ahead as if the words being spoken had no connection to her reality. But the strongest blow came when the prosecutor turned to motive, not with anger, but with solemn clarity. He described a mother so consumed by fear of losing control over her daughter that her worry curdled into something obsessive. He spoke of the tension between Valerie and Eli, the conversations Lila shared, the subtle hostility that grew into something more dangerous. He painted a portrait not of a monster, but of a human being whose love had mutated into possession. And possession, when threatened, becomes violence. Valerie's attorney countered with a quieter narrative, one built around emotional instability, trauma, and desperation. They portrayed her as a woman who feared for her daughter's future, who felt overwhelmed, abandoned by her support system, and misled by Eli's intentions. They didn't deny the meeting took place. They didn't deny her presence at the trail. Instead, they insisted she never intended harm. They hinted that Eli's death was the result of a confrontation that spiraled unexpectedly, a tragic accident framed by panic. But every attempt to soften Valerie's actions rubbed raw against the undeniable evidence that she had planned the encounter carefully and concealed her involvement even more carefully. Still, the defense had one last hope. Lila, Valerie's attorney, called her to the stand with a soft, almost sympathetic tone, as though trying to wrap her in pity before the questioning began. Lila's heart pounded as she approached the witness stand. Her palms were sweaty. Her throat felt tight. She took the oath with a trembling hand, lowering herself into the chair as though it might collapse beneath the weight of everything she carried. Her eyes flicked toward her mother, but Valerie didn't meet her gaze this time. She looked straight ahead, rigid, waiting. That small disconnect hurt more than any shouted accusation could have. The questions began gently, details about her relationship with Eli, the last time she saw him, the messages exchanged that night. Lila answered each one with a voice that trembled but did not break. She spoke of Eli's hope for reconciliation with her mother, his belief in healing, his attempt to bridge a divide he hadn't created. She spoke of his gentleness, his patience, his optimism. And with every word, Valerie's expression twitched ever so slightly, but enough to show that hearing the truth aloud was like sandpaper against her nerves. The defense attempted to redirect, insinuating that Lila might have misunderstood, that emotions blurred memories, that grief twisted recall. But Lila's responses sharpened with each attempt to distort. She wasn't there to protect her mother anymore. She wasn't there to maintain the illusion of a stable home. She was there for Eli, for herself, for truth. And then came the question everyone feared. Lila, the defense attorney said carefully, "Do you believe your mother is capable of harming someone intentionally?" The courtroom went silent. Lila's breath caught. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to a tunnel, her mother on one end, the memory of Eli on the other. She felt her heart pulling in opposite directions, one tied to years of obligation, the other tied to love and justice. She lowered her gaze, eyes burning. "Yes," she whispered. "I do." Gasps rippled through the room, quiet but sharp. Valerie's composure shattered. A small, broken sound escaped her lips, like the crack of something once strong finally giving way. She reached out slightly, fingers trembling, not toward the jury, not toward the judge, but toward her daughter. A silent plea, a desperate denial. A mother begging the world to believe she was still good. But Lila didn't look back. The prosecution continued, asking about the overheard phone call. Lila recounted the moment with painful clarity. The urgent whispers, the insistence that everything was handled, the panic behind her mother's voice. Her truth was steady now, solid, unshakable, and each word tightened the chain around Valerie's defense until it snapped completely. By the time closing arguments began, the courtroom had transformed into a crucible where every lie, every shard of justification, every manipulated memory melted under the heat of undeniability. The prosecutors spoke of choice, of responsibility, of a young man whose life was stolen because someone refused to let go of control. The defense spoke of desperation, mental unraveling, and maternal instinct twisted by fear. But the jury didn't need theatrics. They needed truth. And truth had been laid bare. When they returned, their verdict was delivered in a voice that wavered but did not falter. Guilty. Valerie's breath emptied from her lungs in a shuddering exhale. She closed her eyes not in acceptance, but in disbelief, as though she still couldn't comprehend that the world she built had finally collapsed around her. As officers approached to take her into custody, she looked at Lila with a kind of devastation that could have broken stone. "I did it for you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Everything was for you." Lila's eyes filled with tears, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was resolute in a way it had never been before. "No," she said softly. "You did it to me." And just like that, the trial ended not with shouting, not with chaos, but with a quiet truth that echoed louder than anything else spoken in that courtroom. A mother sentenced, a daughter freed, a community forever changed. The weeks after the verdict unfolded with a strange, almost disorienting quiet. Courtrooms emptied. Cameras disappeared. Neighbors stopped whispering. The frenzy that had consumed the community slowly dissolved, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the chaos that came before it. For some, the end of the trial marked closure. For others, it marked the beginning of questions they never imagined asking. And for Lila, it marked a transition into a world where nothing, absolutely nothing, felt familiar anymore. She moved through those first days like someone relearning gravity. Every step felt tentative, every breath uncertain, as if the ground beneath her might shift again without warning. For the first time in her life, she didn't have her mother's controlling presence hovering over her. She didn't have Eli's comforting hand grounding her. She didn't have the illusion of a family to cling to. What she had now was something else entirely: freedom, but with jagged edges. Independence, but with scars. A future, but one carved from tragedy. She attended Valerie's sentencing with Eli's parents sitting quietly beside her, an unexpected but steady source of support. The courtroom was less crowded this time. The judge recited the sentence with a tone that was firm yet almost mournful. Life without the possibility of parole. Valerie stood stiffly between her attorneys, chin lifted, eyes swollen but dry. She didn't plead. She didn't argue. She didn't speak. Only when she turned to be escorted away did her gaze drift toward Lila. It wasn't anger this time, nor denial. It was something hollow. Something defeated. Something that understood, too late, that the thing she tried to protect had been destroyed by her own hands. Lila didn't look away, but she didn't look at her mother with affection either. Her expression held a quiet resolve, a necessary distance, a painful acceptance. The kind that comes when someone finally understands that love without boundaries isn't love at all, it's ownership. And ownership, when threatened, becomes violence. After the sentencing, Lila walked outside with Eli's parents, the winter sun low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched toward the courthouse steps. Eli's mother reached for her hand gently, squeezing it with the tenderness only someone who had known immense loss could offer. "You did the right thing," she whispered, even when it felt impossible. Lila nodded, though part of her wondered if the right thing and the painful thing were simply two sides of the same truth. In the days that followed, Lila returned to her dorm, to her classes, to the pieces of her life that still remained unbroken. But she wasn't the same girl she had been before all of this. Not the anxious daughter shaped by her mother's expectations, not the smiling young woman in Eli's arms in the photos taped to her desk. She had stepped into something deeper, heavier, more honest. Growth forged in the harsh fire of reality rather than the sheltered world her mother once built around her. She boxed up Valerie's belongings from her childhood home one weekend, moving slowly through each room as memories rose like dust in the sunlight. The kitchen where her mother taught her to measure flour exactly. The living room where nothing was ever out of place. The bedroom where she once practiced saying no under her breath because saying it aloud never felt safe. She packed what she needed. She kept what mattered. And she let go of the rest, not out of anger, but out of a quiet understanding that healing required room to breathe. Her past had taken up enough space already. One evening, she returned to the coastal trail, the place where everything ended, and in some strange way, where everything began. The sun was setting, spilling warm hues across the sky, turning the waves below into shifting gold. She stood at the overlook where Eli had taken his final steps, feeling the wind brush through her hair like a familiar voice. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, letting the sounds of the ocean settle around her. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the air. "I couldn't save you, but I won't forget you." Those words drifted outward, swallowed by the endless horizon. They weren't enough to ease the ache, but they were the beginning of something important. A promise to herself as much as to Eli. A promise that she would not let tragedy define her. That she would not carry guilt for choices that weren't hers. That she would honor his memory by living the life he wanted for her. One filled with possibility, not fear. As winter slipped into spring, Lila slowly rebuilt her world. She switched her major. She joined a campus support group. She began therapy. She allowed herself to talk about the grief that once threatened to drown her. And slowly, painfully, she learned how to smile again, small smiles at first, hesitant and fleeting, but real, genuine. The kind of smiles that grow from surviving the unimaginable. She also visited Eli's family often, sharing stories, laughter, silence, whatever the moment required. They didn't try to replace what was lost. They simply held space for each other in a world that had taken more than it had given. Their home, once a place of sharp grief, began to feel like a refuge for her, a place where love did not demand obedience and where affection was not conditional. Meanwhile, Valerie adjusted, if one could call it that, to her new life in prison. Her early days were filled with denial, then anger, then periods of spiraling distress. But eventually, the truth settled around her like a cold, immovable stone. She was alone. Her control was gone. Her world was gone. The daughter she claimed to protect had become the daughter she pushed away. And with every passing month, the weight of her choices grew heavier, her justifications thinner, her reflections sharper. The punishment wasn't only the sentence, it was the realization that she had misinterpreted love so profoundly that she destroyed the very person she wanted to keep. Sometimes, late at night, she wrote letters to Lila pages filled with explanations, rationalizations, apologies, and pleas. Letters she never sent. Letters she knew, deep down, would not undo the damage or soften the truth. Love, she finally understood, cannot be shaped through force. It cannot be controlled or molded or contained. It must be allowed to grow freely or not at all. 2 years after the trial, Lila stood again at the coastal trail, this time with a steady heart and a clear mind. She placed a small bouquet of wildflowers near the memorial marker, the ocean breeze lifting the petals gently. She stayed there for a long, quiet moment. Then she whispered a soft goodbye, not to Eli, but to the version of herself who had lived in fear, who had been shaped by someone else's wants, who had believed she needed permission to breathe. As she walked back toward the path, sunlight warmed her face, and for the first time in years, she felt something simple and profound. Peace. Not the peace of forgetting. She would never forget. Not the peace of erasing the past. She carried her history with her. This was the peace of reclaiming herself. A life rebuilt, a future earned, a truth accepted. And from that day forward, Lila walked not as a victim of what happened, but as the author of what would come next.